And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio. Our next guest is freelance investigative journalist Justin Ling. Thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thank you for having me.
So, I've followed your work for a long time. You've written a lot about many different subjects, but one that you've really honed in on is misinformation and conspiracy theories. And before we get into some of the more recent ones in regards to Ukraine, I'm just interested, I'm sure our listeners would be as well, as to what drove you to want to get into the reporting side of the conspiracy world, and what does that actually look like when you're learning about what these people think?
Yeah, I think from the very start of my career, this was something that always intrigued me. I remember writing a journalism school assignment about 9/11 conspiracy theorists, and I ended up in the passenger seat of a cab of the leader of a conspiracy theory party that believed water fluoridation was making us all stupid, and that the government was tracking our cell phones at all times, right? And I remember just thinking, this guy is nuts, but the things he says and the things he puts out, especially online, have a constituency, and they have an impact, and they have an influence. And as the years went on, it became clearer and clearer just how significant of an impact things like this can have. The pipeline between conspiracy theorists, people we don't trust, people we think are out to lunch, people we try to ignore, the pipeline between what they say and do, and some people in elected office, people in the media, influential figures, is direct. And it has become more and more direct, and has become more and more kind of voluminous in the last few years. You have people peddling theories around the World Economic Forum, secretly controlling our government, that makes its way straight into the Conservative Party of Canada. You have allegations that COVID-19 was a bioweapon designed in a lab, getting airing from the president of the United States. And it's wild to understand where these things actually come from, and how they get kind of obscured as they become more and more popular. And there's a real, I think, value in understanding where these things come from, and why they're as effective as they are.
So, real quick follow up on that, just because you said the link between the conspiracy theory world and elected officials or influential voices. Do you think that has been heightened? Maybe because there's either people are engaging or consuming alternative media because of a distrust for, I don't like saying mainstream media, but let's say mainstream media, or is there something more nefarious here where it's more of a concerted effort by problematic parties to pump some of this stuff out?
I mean, I think it's both. I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of the time the trying influence alternative media. I write for some alternative publications. I certainly read a bunch. So it's not all of them, but there is a class of outlets, largely online, some of them still in print, some of them on the radio or TV, that make a real effort to promote these conspiracy theories, and are happy to sort of repackage them into something more palatable to the general public. And this isn't terribly new, right? I mean, to give you a really brief history lesson, just of the 20th century, you go back to, I think, what was it, 1912, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion comes out as a pamphlet alleging that Jews are secretly running the world economy, which becomes part of the basis for Hitler's Mein Kampf. Obviously, becomes the ideological underpinning of the Nazi regime. You go right up to the 1960s. The John Chers repackaged that an allegation that the bankers are controlled by a small number of families who really run the world, which sparks an anti-communist fervor. You go to the 90s, and the Patriot movement uses shortwave radio and the mail to allege that a new world order is being run by a whole bunch of shadowy groups like the Bilderberg Group, which is partly what inspires the Oklahoma City bombing. And you go right up to the 21st century, and the internet just becomes a new vehicle for stuff like that. And you've even seen, to bring it right back around, you've even seen the Protocols of the Elders of Zion become a quintessential document for QAnon. So the media and social media helps all of this stuff. But this stuff always finds a way into the general consciousness.
So, very quick question to you, Justin. Again, we're speaking with Justin Ling, freelance journalist. Latest article, by the way, Foreign Policy: How U.S. bioweapons in Ukraine became Russia's new big lie. So, I think I want to focus on the Ukraine thing. David and I have colleagues in Ukraine. They've been helping people get across the border. They've been, helping feed them. They've been getting them all the supplies that they need. And we're dealing with this sort of reticent movement throughout the U.S. and Canada, essentially saying that this stuff is not happening or that it's NATO's fault. And now this whole thing about bioweapons. I would just kind of like to put it forward that we don't really know what it's like to have a real bad guy in the world. Do you think that's something we could say about Russia? Because it seems as if the central point of many of these conspiracies is trying to just find the shadowy elite, the bad people. We're not really prepared when it's a nation state and a military. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. I don't know that it's so much an effort to make. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think there's two things going on. I think there is a strain of this conspiracy movement who feels like the enemy of the enemy is my friend, right? They hate the U.S. government and what it represents so intently that they are willing to find common cause with even Vladimir Putin, who they may not ideologically believe in. And this happens right now on the left and on the right. You've seen members of the far left, members of the Communist Party or various communist parties, because they can never pick just one, who firmly believe that Vladimir Putin is on the side of angels and that he is a kind of instigator for a new kind of socialist revolution, and therefore they support the invasion of Ukraine. They also see Ukraine as sort of a liberal globalist problem. And this isn't new. I mean, the far left opposition to, the far left kind of let's say sympathization of brutal dictators and genocide invokers goes back quite some time. The fervent hatred of NATO led the far left to basically aligning with Slobodan Milosevic in the Yugoslav war. So I mean, this isn't terribly new. But there's also on the far right a sort of sympathy that lies with Vladimir Putin, because they see him as a rejection of sort of Western liberal decadence, right? They see him as a guy who believes in quote unquote family values, a guy who believes in, frankly, in some cases, racial purity. In some instances, somebody who rejects globalization and the New World Order and all of this. And really, that's actually what's at the heart of this biolabs conspiracy theory, right? Biolabs in many ways just become sort of a symbol for what Vladimir Putin is resisting against in this mindset, right? So QAnon has for quite some time believed that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have been aligned in a common purpose to fight against the deep state that is present in America, right? Because they believe the deep state is sort of an internationalist movement where the World Economic Forum and Hillary Clinton and Justin Trudeau are faces, but just puppets. Fundamentally, they see Vladimir Putin as resisting against that, and they believe that Vladimir Putin is striking these biolabs in order to destroy this cabal's agent of control, which is viruses like COVID-19. And I realize this all sounds ludicrous, because when you actually explain conspiracy theories, you sound like the crazy one. But this is what's been written down and explained and conveyed and repeated ad nauseum by thousands of people online. It has been dressed up in fancier language by Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump Jr. and others. But fundamentally, this is what the allegation is. Tulsi Gabbard is a great example. Now, does every single person who repeats this theory believe that this is about fighting a war against the deep state? No. Many people are either ignorant of that or realize that's the allegation, but don't care because they want to manipulate the QAnon masses to essentially do their bidding and spread this disinformation. But fundamentally, this is the theory that these biolabs are creating pathogens like COVID-19 that are going to be deliberately released by the West to invoke panic so that new lockdown measures can be put in place, and that ultimately a social credit system like the one that China runs can be imposed on the masses so that these globalists can have total control.
And so I feel like this is probably I find it is often true for most conspiracy theories, but I assume it would be true, and I'll have you explain. Where people will take one item that has maybe a sliver of fact, so like a university research center, and be like, well, they handle something that is infectious there. They do research, and then all of a sudden it morphs into, look at all of these big city biolabs in Ukraine, and they just so happen to overlap with the bombings. Is that what we're seeing here with this? Where what is a biolab is fundamentally different than what is being claimed in terms of bioweapons labs and all sorts of nefariousness?
Yeah, and I mean, conspiracy theorists love the refrain that there's no such thing as coincidences, and of course, any thinking person knows coincidences are a daily occurrence. But of course, you have to cast that aside. You have to kind of put aside disbelief and skepticism in order to believe these things. Let me give you an example of how this works. In 1999, Alex Jones, who would go on to become famous from InfoWars, produced a documentary about Bohemian Grove, which is this park in Northern California. And he alleged that this park was being used by, again, a shadowy cabal of leaders and captains of industry in America to plot nefarious deeds. He alleged they got together and did satanic rituals and chants, Gregorian chants, and sacrificed somebody at an altar. And the trouble is that it was partly true. There actually was this weird meeting of US presidents and captains of industry and media figures and so on and so forth. And they did weird rituals and dances and plays. And it was weirdly satanic in some respects. But they did not, as Alex Jones alleged, sacrifice a child in a bonfire, or use this to plot the New World Order, or control the world economy, or what have you. Right? He took an element of something that was true that looks really gross and used it to extrapolate a much broader conspiracy theory. And fundamentally, it works by saying, if they're lying to you about this one thing that's true, which they weren't really, but that's his retelling. If they're lying to you about this thing that's true, then they must be lying to you about everything. And it plays on people's distrust of the ruling class quite effectively. And actually, that documentary inspired a man to break into Bohemian Grove fully armed with an assault rifle and a shotgun and a homemade explosive, with the plan to liberate the children who are being held there. So, and he would do the same thing 20 years later with the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. So, yeah, history does love to repeat itself. So, with this biolabs thing, it's a very similar ordeal. There are biological laboratories in Ukraine. They are US funded. They are funded by the Pentagon. But what you have to realize is that is really normal. There are hundreds of labs around the world that are funded by the Pentagon, because the Pentagon wants to fund research that leads to fewer outbreaks of the plague, anthrax, which is naturally occurring in some instances, of yellow fever, of dengue fever, of so on and so forth, right? This is what the US government says it does, and it's what they're doing. They want to prevent infectious disease outbreaks. They want to prevent the next COVID-19 from happening. They want to prevent the next Ebola outbreak. And it just so happens that region of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus is a breeding ground for a ton of infectious diseases like this. What's more, there are remnants of the Soviet era bioweapons program, which was real, which we know was real, where there needs to be effort put in to maintaining those facilities to make sure that some of these still present samples do not leak out. Most of them have been destroyed, thanks to the US, but there are samples and facilities that still need constant upkeep. And that's what the US does. And if you take that and spin it under nefarious music and make a bunch of connections to shadowy figures who people don't like, then you can certainly convince them that all of this has a malicious intent that it really doesn't.
Yeah, these globalists, they got a plan for everything. So
it's a pretty good Alex Jones
there you go.
impression.
Working on it. So I would say that we are on right wing radio, as it were. So I'd also recommend Justin's podcast, The Flamethrowers, from the CBC. But I did want to ask a question about the events of the last few weeks, and specifically cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, because we went from about a month where people could send their Bitcoin to the trucker convoy in Ottawa, and now people are sending their Bitcoin to arm the Ukrainians, to buy some Javeliers and all the rest. I will recommend, again, all of your writing on the Freedom Convoy and everything else. Sort of, what do you see as this kind of evolution of cryptocurrency? We'll be speaking on this program as well with Michelle Garner. Is that it, David? Yes. So we'll be talking to her about her cryptocurrency bill. Sort of, what do you see on that? Because you're a big privacy advocate and the like. I'm wondering what the evolution of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are when you see that they can fund, occupations like in Ottawa, but also help out the Ukrainian military in times of need.
Yeah. I'm actually going to tie it back to what you first said, right? And it's that sometimes these sort of unorganized platforms can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. And as much as you might really want to regulate them, you're only going to kind of impose misery on yourself. And right-wing radio is a great example. You go back to the 1960s and John F. Kennedy Jr. tried to impose the fairness doctrine on radio to sort of snuff out conservative voices who were overly critical of him. And in fairness, sometimes peddling in conspiracy theories like the Birchers. But it ultimately turned into a catastrophe. I mean, he basically choked off free speech on the radio and made free speech basically so costly that no one was willing to do it. And when that was finally repealed by Ronald Reagan in the 80s, it led to this explosion of conservative talk radio, and often for the worse. I mean, you had very astute, smart voices, but you also had the Rush Limbaughfication of talk radio, which sort of enabled the rise of Alex Jones and in many cases made superstars out of utter morons like Glenn Beck. So when it comes to Bitcoin, I think there's a lot of wrong with it, right? I think Bitcoin enables the kind of money laundering and in some cases even terrorist financing that we've tried so hard to crush out of our financial system over the past several decades. But at the same time, it also enables the funding of free speech advocates. It also enables the funding of those fighting repressive regimes abroad. It enables privacy to some degree. I mean, Bitcoin is not the most private of all the currencies, but to the degree that it does, it enables private transactions that to some degree we should be allowed to have. Not everything has to run through a government financial system, and I think Bitcoin is an opportunity to do exactly that. At the same time, we do have to figure out how to kind of manage those linkages between Bitcoin and our actual financial system, so that we're not enabling mass criminality and not enabling terror financing. And it's a difficult question. I do not know the answer to it. I'm not a Bitcoin guy myself. It's not a platform I'm super intrigued by, and frankly, the most ardent advocates of Bitcoin are enough to turn anybody off of cryptocurrency. But I think I think it's a promising platform, and we have to be really skeptical of efforts to over-regulate it or regulate it out of existence.
Very good point. Very good point. This has been our chat with Justin Ling. Thank you, Justin, for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thanks for having me.